joining us on Village Online. I'm glad you've chosen to drop in, and I'm excited because today Stan Mitchell is in town, and we thought we'd have a little conversation. Stan, welcome. It's good to see you.
Good to be back.
We have had some of the best theological discussions of my life, and every time we have them, I wish that we had the camera going.
That's what we always say. And then we go get the camera and we can
It's
replicate the
dry
magic.
as dust. Yeah,
Well, not that bad.
not that bad. Before we did the series on prayer, I did call Stan, and I said, what are some of your thoughts on prayer? And he said some things really profound. It actually shaped some of the things I shared in the series. And I was just wondering this beautiful afternoon if you'd share some thoughts that we just kind of talked about as it relates to prayer. Because some people talk about prayer and it's trauma. I don't understand that exactly, but it represents trauma to them. We've discovered people still pray, even if they've moved a little more on the progressive side of things. And I just love to have your insights on prayer a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's being a progressive pastor in a progressive Christian space the last 20 years. In terms of practical theology, like taking the abstract and really playing it out in our lives, prayer is one of two or three of the most frequently honed in on practical aspects of what are the implications of this theology. Prayer and worship. How do we worship now and how do we pray now if our view of God has shifted? Going back to when you asked me the question, I think you guys did 3 or 4 weeks on prayer. So this was a month ago when you called and said, let's just kind of tease our brains for a little bit around the subject of prayer. But as soon as you asked me, what do you think about prayer? Just kind of that innocuous question. What do you think about prayer? Man, instantly, I had 100 competing thoughts. And lots of theology, lots of God stuff, lots of, kind of the erudite, heady, esoteric things. As I sit there a minute, I don't know if you remember this, but the first thing that I said in response, I said, after pausing for 15 seconds, I said, well, I think a lot of things, but I think the primary thing that I would say is I still do it.
That resonated with me because I've been thinking a lot of those heady thoughts, and I was thinking, but I still find myself praying, even though I don't understand it. I don't know if I'm doing internal dialogue with myself always, if I'm talking to God. But that was helpful to me when you said, I still do it. Do you find that's true kind of across the board with people? Are they thinking that way? Or
I don't know too many people who don't pray. It just depends on how severe the circumstances have to be before you finally do. Even my non-theistic friends, most of my non-theistic friends admit on their side of non-theism that they have no more certainty about that than we do on our side of theism. Most of us are, I always say, we're all agnostics, which means we don't know. Some are agnostic with theistic leanings, some are agnostic with non-theistic leanings. I'm an agnostic, someone who doesn't know. And within my Christianity, I've always been satisfied that Jesus asked me to believe. He never asked me to know.
Right.
Well, I can do that.
Right.
But with my theistic leanings, sometime my knowings, my believings are stronger than others. And, so I think even my non-theistic friends, in their not knowing, in the most desperate moment, even they become partial believers in the idea of intercessory prayer. I always think about Simon Peter when he started sinking. If you really want to find out what somebody believes, listen to whose name they call. Watch what they do when they start sinking.
Yeah.
And, I'm not even sure Simon Peter knew exactly who he believed in. I think I know what he would have said. But when he started sinking, he said, Lord, save me. And I think in all of our desperate hours, there's some inclination, whether that's deep certainty, hopeful believing, dreaming, wishing. So I think one of the questions that I have for you when I was thinking about you doing the series is, you asked me how I feel about prayer. My question back is, what do you mean by prayer?
Right.
Are we even working with a common definition here? So when you, what's the simplest base number one definition? What do you mean by prayer?
I did have to think through that because I think it started out for me. There was always the asking. That's how I thought. I think I understood prayer. It's just asking God for these things that I thought God was going to do for me, and has moved beyond that. And then it went through a period where it was very much a set time every day, and it was a set length of time every day, and it was just a ritual or routine I was going through. But it has moved to a place where it is, to me, a dialogue that is ongoing all day, all the time, kind of pray without ceasing idea. But whether it is just this wrestling in my mind, I just believe that that's kind of for me what prayer is. It's this thought process that I have ongoing all the time, and I'm not expecting any miraculous lightning bolts from heaven. Although I ask in my mind that this, I really would love for this to happen, and it has become. And you were helpful to me on that around the whole Brueggemann understanding of the Psalms, but also the a naivete and sophistication, and the thought that it's not this simplistic thing where we say it and God does it. It's not that. It's more of a wrestling that I have inside here. So for me, that's more of what it is. But I'd like to know what your thought is.
The simplest definition for me is communication with God. So there's two parts there. Communication. So I'm talking, I'm communicating, I'm listening. But obviously the second part is God. So when I say practical theology, I do mean practical theology because the practicum is I'm doing something. But I'm doing it in the context of a belief in God. So this really it's not just practical, it is also theological. And I would still say for me, prayer is communication with God. So the assumption is still there is a God. Then you know as well as I do, for most theistic people, especially those of us coming from conservative backgrounds, many of us have taken a journey in terms of our view of God. Is God a personal, individuated being, a Burl Ives grandfather in the sky? Yeah. Is God a Star Wars force that is kind of a cosmic element and underpinning that's metaphysical but is just as real as the physical, and is this cosmic wholeness? What and who is God? And I there's no way for me, if prayer for me, and I do still kind of come back to the simplicity, it is communication with God, then the way I view the idea of God is incredibly impactful to how I pray. And that view for me has maintained some fluidity because my personal juxtaposition or internal juxtaposition, my relationship with God mentally, spiritually, for a long time, it was one of, it was servile, it was deferential, it was worshipful. God was clearly this individuated being who was the primal source of all things. God was a he, and God had created us. And so that demanded some things of me. My relationship with the idea, the person, the concept, the reality of God, my internal relationship with that, the way I angle myself to that these days psychically, is more along the lines of awe. When I think about my dispositions, there's awe, there's a lot of curiosity, and I still have an underpinning of gratitude. Like Buechner says, I who might not have been am. I have a sense of source, and I am grateful to the source for my existence. But awe and mystery and curiosity are more the way that I relate to God these days, as opposed to certainty, acuity of ideas, deference, and obligation of worship. Those things don't resonate with me anymore. So there's a big difference in communicating with someone out of obligation, deference, worship, and servanthood, as opposed to curiosity, awe,
That's profound.
gratitude, and latitude. I really, Anne Lamott said something in Traveling Mercies that I thought was extraordinarily beautiful. She said when she was 7 years old and was in a very scary household, her parents were big partiers back in the 60s, 70s, well-heeled academic people, but lots of pretty wild parties, she said, used to happen in her home, that she was sent to her room and she only knew the parties by the sounds that came through the walls, and the sounds were scary to that little girl. And she said before she even had been introduced to the language or the concept of God, much less prayer, she said as a scared little girl in her room, covers pulled up over her head, she said, I remember talking to someone I believed was listening. And she didn't know the nomenclature for that. She didn't know, the religious underpinnings of that. She just had an intuitive, sense that she could. Not only that she needed to, but that she could talk to someone who was listening. You know how there are times you read things and it's like you strike, you hit the middle C and the tuning fork hums. I have those every now and then. And I remember 20 years ago when I read that, I thought I could feel the hum of the tuning fork in me. 20 years later, man, I think a lot differently than I did 20 years ago. That one still hums for me.
I love that. It was, I don't know if it was shocking to me, but I know you said you watched the thing we did on Mother's Day where I just asked these women that I admire so much just to write about prayer and their experience. And they all had experiences where they couldn't explain it. They don't know if it holds up against any kind of scrutiny, scientific scrutiny or whatever. But there were just instances where they called out and they just believed that God heard them. And it was beautiful. Jane and Joyce and Joe, it was just amazing, all these people. Is that what you're saying? That just...
I resonate with that. If religion could be a consortium, a warehouse of experiences where people can come with awe, with mystery, with humility, and articulate experiences that really, as Paul said about his third heaven experience, he said it's ineffable, it's unspeakable. So we're always speaking about the unspeakable. Well, if I can bring a humility and say, I'm articulating, like the ladies on Mother's Day, they were articulating experiences that were beyond the words. And I can believe that other people are sincerely articulating similar experiences. To be able to hold those with no obligation to reconcile them doctrinally, to reconcile them and make sure that they're consistent with themes that fit, a preconceived orthodoxy, to come with stories that aren't even demanding other people believe them, that don't. I have stories, honestly, raised in the religious setting we are, I have 3 or 4 stories that I tell no one because they are too precious to me for me to even open them to speculation. I don't want to sully them by having somebody doubt them because they weren't for anybody else. They were for me. They're not sermon material. They're not religious demand material. They're not material that's going to inspire someone to convert to me. There's something that changed me, and I hold them, and I feel like it's like the angel speaking to Mary and saying, just ponder it in your heart, almost self-protectively for her, because nobody would believe it anyway.
Right.
And when she did slip up and tell people they didn't believe her, some experiences are just for you. And I think things like prayer and worship and interaction with the divine, we want those things so badly that I think we try to control them with a measured certainty, and then we take all the juice out of them by turning them into a doctrine.
Did you ever have the issue with demanding of God and then expecting that if it didn't happen that God somehow failed you? Because that never was really a part of my background. So I never have, when I hear people say, our daughter didn't get healed and so I'm just angry at God, I always thought terrible things happen. That's just the way it works. But some people, that's a big deal. And to them, prayer is this, I guess it's a certainty thing. And when it doesn't work out like they want it to, then it becomes a need for them to bail or whatever. That's not your experience, though.
Well, of course, I grew up in the Pentecostal world. You grew up in the Baptist world. And in the Pentecostal world, there was more of that. And there was, I mean, the faith movement is it's a subculture of the Pentecostal culture. And it was one that if I wasn't always in, I was at least at the borders of. And I can say this about that, harkening back to the title of Philip Yancey, one of his early books, Disappointment with God. Yeah. I was continually around really good people who, on the other side of the miracle not happening, were left with this horrible choice. Had God failed them or had they failed God?
Yeah.
And I watched people dance between the two. And most of the time, our people fell on the safer side of believing that they had failed God. Because if we have failed God, then there's something to correct there. If God has failed us, all is lost. And I remember the untenable pain of that whole deal. And I pretty early on, that was one of those moments that I stored away. And there was an accumulation of 100 of these moments before I ever articulated the label for this grouping. But I had these intuitive experiences. If that's who God is, then we are all doomed. And then the parenthetical was, that can't be who God is. And none of those experiences move me in and of themselves, but there's finally this moment when hundreds of them have accumulated, and it breaks you off from the dock, and it moves you out into the ocean that we call deconstruction, disorientation, which is just, that's not a new experience. That's been happening to humans forever, but with those kinds of experiences. And prayer was a big one, because growing up in the Pentecostal world, I watched really faithful people not praying for the next car payment to be made, but you finally watch people praying for their 7-year-old to live.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember one lady testifying at our church. She had lost a child, a teenager, in a car accident. And she had prayed for angels to be around and had trusted that they were, and that God would answer her prayer with protection. And when that didn't happen, she told the story of how that brought her to the brink of losing God. She literally said, under the construct of this idea of prayer, she literally said, I realized I had already lost my son, and that was enough. I didn't want to lose God too. Wow, what an onerous burden.
That's a burden.
To just be trying to redeem God. And it's so unnecessary. We're always trying to redeem God from horrible ideas, preconceived notions about God, that if there is a God, that God had nothing to do with.
I'm wondering if you would kind of wrap it up with, because I've never heard anybody talk about the naivete and sophistication and then coming all the way around. And you talk about it with Christmas, but I think it also probably sounds like it's a similar application with prayer and how you understand prayer, that it started out one way and it's moved to where it means something richer and deeper than ever before.
I think it's an overarching schematic that works in all of, human maturation, human development. Of course, the social psychologists like Piaget and Erickson, they were some of the first to give us these stages of life that we move through in terms of, weaning ourselves little by little. And they articulated multiple stages of life. And then, of course, James Fowler came along and he took Piaget and Erickson's work of stages of life and made them into stages of faith, and it's brilliant stuff. Brian McLaren has 4 stages. There's lots of ways to divide this pie up, lots of nomenclature. My favorite is still 2, and that's Walter Brueggemann that you mentioned a while ago in his Psalms.
I think I told you I used it from Stan. I want to go ahead.
But Brueggemann's commentary on the Psalms, it's a little book. It's one of my favorites, and I would really recommend it. But Brueggemann in there, it's just an aside in there, but Brueggemann said there are a lot of ways to divide up the Psalms, but the way that he has found to most effective for him, especially devotionally and personally, is there are Psalms of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. And by orientation, he's talking about the naive orientation of ideas being imposed upon you as a child that you live into. And then the disorientation when those ideas aren't necessarily commensurate to your life, and the answers to the questions aren't lining up, and everything you memorized is not, and you move into disorientation. And then maturity is when you move from disorientation into reorientation, and you begin to mature and find your own answers to the questions, and even more than that, find out that there are new questions in your own soul. Paul Ricoeur, the French existentialist that died less than a decade ago, almost 100 years old. Ricoeur was a brilliant philosopher, and this isn't his main work, but Ricoeur gave us the idea of stages of spiritual development. And he, like Brueggemann, he gave it in a triad. He called it 2 different things. He called it pre-critical thought, critical thought, and post-critical thought. And that makes sense. Pre-critical thought, that's naive orientation. And then critical thought is Brueggemann's disorientation, where you begin to critically apply lenses to these things and begin to see the flaws and fissures of the ideas. They're not holding up under the critical lens. And then, of course, post-critical thought. I like that language, post-critical. Mm-hmm. Not anti-critical, but on the other side of criticism. It gives criticism its space. It doesn't deny it. It's spiral dynamics. It transcends and includes as opposed to matures and rejects. Mm-hmm. And so I like that pre-critical, critical, and post-critical. My favorite language of his was he referred to those stages as first naivete, sophistication. And he puts air quotes around sophistication, and then second naivete. And the illustration that we often use is Santa Claus. First naivete, Santa Claus, there is a demand not only for the truth and the reality of Santa Claus, but the truth and the reality of Santa Claus is conflated with a demand for a literal North Pole, a literal old man who can circumnavigate the world and go down every chimney in one night on a sleigh, and elves and a workshop and a legitimate North Pole and a Mrs. Claus. So the truth of Santa Claus demands the historicity and the scientific fact of Santa Claus. And then, of course, then there's sophistication. Our children find out that Santa Claus is not a literal being, and reindeer really don't fly, and Rudolph doesn't have a shiny nose, and an old man isn't coming down eating the cookies that we leave at the mantle. And that sophistication, again, Ricoeur called that criticism. And it's a place that liberates the person from the hyper demand for literalism and the abuse of that literalism. And there's a freedom that comes with criticism. But Brueggemann said the freedom begins to find its weakness in its sophistication, because it begins to find a new arrogance, a new legalism. It's the young child who finds out there's not a Santa Claus, they think, and they scoff at all the other kids who still believe that, and are aghast that their parents ever lied to them, and they're angry about it, and they want to undermine all of that. But then, of course, there's where hopefully we eventually mature, and that's the second naivete. And I love the idea that he goes back and captures the first word, naivete. There's a post-criticism, and post-criticism and second naivete blend together the goodness of the previous 2 stages. It blends together the hope and the wonder and the curiosity of first naivete and pre-critical thought with the skill set and the lenses, the telescopes, the microscopes, the better way of seeing the critical thinking of criticism. The second naivete not only heals us and allows us to move beyond the literalism of pre-critical thought, it also heals us from the dryness and the hopelessness and the absence of comfort that can come in what Rohr refers to that critical, sophisticated stage as eventually ending in a desert of criticism. And Rohr says we are called again from the desert of criticism to become as a child. And that's Jesus being born again. That's why I think a lot of mainline, the early liberal iteration of Christianity, is full of a lot of white hair. All of us evangelicals used to think it's because, well, that church is dying. Those liberal churches are dying. No. It's because it takes a half to 2/3 of life to finally come back to the space of worship, to get through the critical thought of sophistication that says all of that is a bunch of hooey and a joke, to come back and sing Santa Claus is coming to town again and actually mean it more than you ever did when you demanded a literal like the old. And I just think that same rubric you and I can apply again and again and again. It is a spiritual leaning and it's a spiritual maturity. I don't remember who the person who first said it was, but I think it was Richard Rohr quoted. The young person who doesn't weep, the pre-critical first naivety youth who doesn't weep is a barbarian. But the old person who gets stuck in those tears and doesn't learn to laugh again is a fool. And I think first naivete and pre-criticism, as it relates to God, spirituality, miracles, prayer, I think that is the place that is absent of tears and full of laughter, and sometimes laughter for the wrong reasons. And I think the first stage out of that is to lose that unfounded laughter. But we not only lose the unfounded laughter, we lose laughter writ large. And the critical lenses show us only the bad, and we think all the good is lost. But I think the new birth is when we begin to suspicion that the unfounded reasons for laughter may not have been the thing that take us home, but they may have been pointing to the thing that takes us home, that there is reason for laughter that we had no maturity for. But if you come through criticism, if you are Mary falling at the feet of Jesus because he didn't show up to heal her brother like she knew he should when she prayed, if Mary will get through that stage, the tears will take her not ultimately to a place of just final tears, but the tears can actually lead us back to a place of laughter that's founded. And I feel like that's where a lot of us are with things like prayer. I pray now and I don't have to forensically account for how it works and how it distills out. But I'm back with that little 7-year-old girl and Lamont, and I'm thinking, I'll be dog. I think I'm talking to someone or something bigger than a thing or one that is listening.
That's so good. I love it. Thank you. This has been wonderful. I can't wait. We're going to be doing more. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for joining us around the subject of prayer. Don't forget, if you'd like to help us support what we're doing with giving to Village Church, Everybody Church, we're right now going through some updating of websites, a lot of things like that. There's information on the screen if you'd like to help. We'd love you to join us. See you soon.